This is my favorite one so far. It's got weight to it, but it's not tannic or astringent. It's got fruit, but it's not overly soft. It's got more body than the rest of them had.
Yeah. And you can see why, because look at the leaves now. They don't look like little twisty little shreds anymore.
Take one out?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. Go crazy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you can eat it. They're edible.
That's what I like about oolongs as well, because those tend to take multiple steepings.
Yeah, we're doing an oolong next.
Oh,
so
good.
There is not a tea in here that does not take multiple steepings. If it doesn't take multiple steepings, then it doesn't belong here.
There's the green.
Yep.
Can I dump this into this container? Okay.
So yeah, and this is a dedicated.
It's not as vegetal astringent as I thought it would be, even to chew.
That's probably got a lot to do with it's the quality of the tea, but it's also the fact that we've steeped it.
Okay.
If you were to eat that like after steeping one, it would be super bitter, super astringent.
We sucked a lot out.
We drank all that astringency.
That's fair.
We drank all the juice.
Which I guess is the whole point of steeping.
It is the whole point. Here, I'll do one more and then we'll move on to episode 2. But yeah, this is my first time trying this particular batch. I had many batches of Manhua Sheng, but we got this batch specifically to put in that barrel. So this 2023, the one we're selling here is 2022. This 2023, this is my first time tasting it, but I really like it. It's nice. I'm very excited to see what it's like after it's
it seems like it leaves a lot of room for things to happen.
That was my idea, because people are always putting Pu-erh in whiskey barrels, red tea in whiskey barrels.
And then they just fight with each other.
Exactly. And you're just kind of stacking on what's already there. But I want to see what happens to this bright, fresh, green, vegetal tea that is much lighter. And
what temperature are you hitting on these?
As I've gotten older and better at steeping tea, I have stopped modulating my temperature. I adjust my pouring technique to whatever temperature, usually boiling.
Okay.
This one, but I wouldn't tell someone coming in here and buying this tea to use boiling water. If it was they're just learning to make it, I'd say you go like down to 195 for this.
Okay. See, I normally hit the 205 setting on mine, and then it goes off, and then when I eventually get to it, it feels like it's the right.
Exactly. Yeah. It's always a feel thing. It's always a feel thing. It's never actually the numerical temperature. It's I always tell people the numerical temperature is like a bumper in the gutter. You know what I mean? It's like when you go bowling with kids and they put the bumpers in the gutter.
Yeah.
If you stick to that temperature range, you're not going to mess up the tea, but if you stick to that temperature range, you'll never progress as a tea server because you are same if you're bowling with bumpers. You know what I mean? You're not learning what the tea's actually doing.
And of course, Corey's saying that we're not losing any of this great content because he's already rolling.
That's
and we're back again.
Yeah. Oh, I should probably put this one away. Yeah.
With West China Tea at the Tea House after 8 weeks. This is the second episode with our great friend Daniel Whittington from the Wizard Academy and many other enterprises in the world. Some that you'll never hear about.
Yes,
and some that'll be recorded forever.
Some that I would have to kill you. And some that I'm going to advertise.
So we're moving on to another tea and another whiskey. Daniel, you were really heavily interested in a lot of the nerdy details about some of these teas.
Yeah, I wanted to know about the fermentation of stuff because there are very specific applications for fermentation in whiskey production, right? Like a lot of because of how grain ferments and what chemicals are created. And I know that fermentation in general across everything from bread to whiskey to beer to whatever has some commonalities that like yeast is an organism. It always eats these sort of sugars. It always exits CO2 and ethanol or alcohol and amino acids, for example, right? And that's where in whiskey, that all happens in a very specific known, like if you want to do highest bottle of alcohol, but you don't really care about the flavor, 48 hours, 50 hours, you get real high alcohol. It's going to taste like crap, but it doesn't matter if you're making vodka.
Right.
But if you want a whiskey that when you distill it is going to have like these fruit notes and these floral impact that doesn't come from the barrel, that comes from the fermentation.
Right.
So then all their websites for these brands are going to brag about their long fermentations. And those can go anywhere from 70 to 120 hours.
And so that means that it takes 120 hours for the fermentation to complete, or it ferments and then they just let it sit there for
I think it's both. So I think I would argue that it's both, even though if what you mean by the word fermentation is creation of alcohol, that usually ends around 50 to 60 hours. Like at the point when the yeast runs out of food, it stops producing things, right? And then the next phase is autolysis, when the yeast dies, right? And when it does that in a beer, for lack of a better term, or what is going to turn into whiskey, the fermentation tank, the cell membrane dissolves, and everything that was in that yeast strain sort of just
is now
unloads in the fermentation, and that's when you get this creation of all these floral, fruity amino acids that show up, right?
Interesting. So it's the yeast lysing that puts those in the beer, and that's what ends up when you distill it. If you distill it in a way that carries those things through, that's what you end up. That's very interesting. I did not know that. That's
now
really
you
cool.
can also get some fruit notes from like finishing in a sherry barrel or a wine cask, but that like really fruity note, which I'm going to show you here in a second.
Okay, cool.
A lot of that comes from the yeast and just makes it all the way through.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
So how does something? My question though is that how does that work? And because I'm assuming that tea doesn't ferment in a liquid container.
Nope.
So how does that work?
So people hear fermentation, they think wine, they think beer, they think yogurt, right? Think cigar.
A liquid container.
Think tobacco.
But I'm gonna have to say, I know that that's a thing, but I don't understand how it works. So still go into the how.
So we're talking, we're not talking yeast. There are yeasts, but it's not like brewer's yeast like you're gonna use to make alcohol, and it's not lactobacillus bacteria that you use to make yogurt or cheese. It's aspergillus mold. Which is what you use to make soy sauce. It's what you use to make sake. And it's it's almost certainly what's fermenting tobacco, pipe tobacco, cigars in a humidor, getting older, aging. I think it might be involved in the fermentation of cacao when you're processing cacao and you're fermenting the cacao seed itself that you actually use to make the chocolate. But this is leaves. There isn't sugar. There's no sugar for the yeast to eat.
So it's got to have a different...
Exactly. It's cellulose being broken down by aspergillus, and that creates these free sugars that are then going to be, these less complex carbohydrates. Cellulose is a carbohydrate.
So this is making me realize I didn't understand that fermentation, how that word was being used scientifically. Because you're talking about a process being called fermentation.
That's right.
As opposed to, in our world, fermentation is yeast eating sugar, creating ethanol. But you're saying and I think my study is so narrow. And I'm not a scientist. I've only studied what I needed to create whiskey.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I've had a very narrow field of study. I don't think I totally picked up on the idea. I mean, it's floating back there, but that fermentation is just a process.
So funny story. My background is actually in biology, and so fermentation is a form of metabolism without having oxygen as an electron receiver. Right, or an a donor. Yeah, I think that's right. But so when you run, you're respiring. It's aerobic respiration, aerobic metabolism. You're breathing in oxygen, but eventually you get to the point when you're like lifting weights or something. You get to a point where it's anaerobic. You used up all the oxygen in your blood.
Which that shows up in whiskey fermentations.
And that is fermentation. So our bodies do ferment also. So anytime you have metabolism without having oxygen, outside the presence of oxygen, you call that fermentation. And so there's tons of different pathways that would all be called fermentation.
That makes so many things line up in my head that I knew all individually, but never really lined them up together.
When we ferment in our muscles, we make lactic acid, and that's why we feel sore. When yeast ferments beer, it makes alcohol.
And CO2 and amino acids.
CO2, exactly.
And when it ferments in leaves, what does it create?
It takes the cellulose and breaks it down into things that can be consumed by other organisms. So there's the mold, and then there's dozens of other yeasts, bacteria, mold, fungi, all kinds of microbes, a whole ecosystem of microbes that are taking this chunk of tea. So I'll go ahead and make this one since we're talking about it. I was going to make this third, but I'll make it second because we're having this specific discussion. Cool. Hopefully it still goes with the tea. But this is some Pu-erh. We just drank a Pu-erh on the last episode. It was a loose, fresh, green Shung Pu-erh. This is a pressed, more aged, 2022, pressed, more aged, and fermented Shu Pu-erh. I'll pass it to you to smell. You're not going to smell hardly anything. because it has.
I think I'm smelling my hands.
Yeah, you're probably gonna smell your hands a lot more than the tea because it's aged, it's dry, it's pressed.
There's
it's
a
not
little,
exuding.
which is strange, but there's a little bit of a chocolate biscuit, like the outside of an Oreo.
Yeah, no, that's not off, Mark. That's definitely a reasonable.
Is that fair?
That's fair.
And this is again,
Actually, yeah, I get that.
You see what I mean?
Like an Oreo.
Yeah.
Not like
Not the cream.
milk chocolate.
No.
Like
But the
chocolate
dusty,
biscuit.
dry
Yeah.
chocolate biscuit.
I've never smelled that in that tea before. Thank you.
and there is a terroir to this varietal as well.
You just need a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing to smell things for you.
No, that's good. That's really it's going on the website.
There we go.
This is a tea called Vanilla Obscura.
Okay.
And so this is we just named it that. You just you've got a whiskey, you give it a name.
Yeah, of
we
course.
gave this one that because otherwise what we'd say is actually this is a 2022 Non-Nuam Mountain Dwo-yi Village small pile fermented Pu-erh is what it is.
Okay.
So no one's going to remember that. We call it Vanilla Obscura, and that's we noticed a little bit of a vanilla extract almost note on the exhale, that retronasal exhale, and that's why we named it this. And it's quite dark. But I'll give you guys a rinse.
Well, I would argue there's probably a lot of vanilla in those chocolate biscuits.
There probably is. There's a ton. But you know what? They're vegan.
Yes,
Oreos
they
are vegan.
Oreos are vegan. Yes,
Oreos are vegan.
I discovered that. Yeah, my fiance is vegan, and it's one of the few things I can just go down the aisle and pick up without worrying about it.
Yeah.
So all of the things that you were talking about, fermentation and the cellulose, I was thinking more in terms of the barrels and the barrel construction. You've got the cellulose, the hemicellulose, then you've got
vegetable.
the yard aging of those barrels.
Right. So
Yeah.
the way that tea ages is a lot more like the way that a barrel ages than it is
It's
the
like
way that the whiskey.
cracking apart of cellulose structures.
Exactly. That's exactly what's going on.
Okay.
And then everything that comes after that, because then you get these smaller, more digestible, more easily digestible, carbohydrates that are then, there's a cascade of organisms that's like Aspergillus is doing the heavy lifting, cracking open that cellulose, which is such a hard molecule. And then all these other things want to eat what comes off of that.
Right.
And so that's where you get this process. But it's not as well understood, I don't think, to my knowledge, based on my research, as when you're describing this.
Yeah.
Because the person, it's a very passive process.
Right.
And you're not stopping it at any point.
Right.
You're just, you do stop it. You stop it after 40 days. If you're doing, the difference between this and what we just drank is that this was piled up, wet down with spring water
Just
from the
to
mountain.
speed that whole process up.
Turn it like compost. It starts as one big pile, covered in a tart, one big pile, tons of tea. This was small pile fermented, so less than a ton of tea. Wet it down, let it sit for however long the tea master decides to let it sit for based on the weather and the temperature and him knowing his room or her knowing her room and where they do the fermentation, their processes, the idiosyncrasies of their tech and everything like that. Decides that, okay, it's time to turn this. We're going to turn it, take shovels, turn it like compost. Now it's one flatter, wider pile.
Okay.
And we're just going to turn it, and eventually you've got an even layer all across the floor after about 40 days, and that's that fermentation process.
Okay.
And it goes from being green like what we just had to black like this.
It's all wild fermentation. They're not. Are they adding or introducing anything?
It lives on the mats where they dry the tea.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just there.
What are the mats made out of?
Bamboo.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
woven
it
bamboo.
holds, but not as much as cloth of some kind.
Yeah, but I'm sure that all of these cultures are on every surface of these tea
Oh, yeah.
farms.
Yeah.
They're just touching every surface that is involved with processing.
So does that provide? Do you find that? What do you call these places? A tea house or a tea instead of a distillery? What would you call?
You call it I guess you would translate it as like a workshop, or, I mean, it's a tea farm, and then they call it, there's a cha zhuang where you're picking it, and then what is it that they call it? You can call it a cha chang, like a tea factory, but the word doesn't mean factory.
Yeah.
Because you think of factory, you think of machinery. What it is, it's going to be, and on this scale, it's going to be a family and their house and their equipment. And that equipment can range from a wok to cook the tea in,
Right.
to make what we just drank.
Rakes.
Yeah, exactly.
So a processing center?
And you have a Saigon Thai. So it's a drying room. So there's one part of the facility is going to be
So
where you
that's
cook
where
the
my
tea.
question's going to come in. Can you recognize? I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No.
Finish that first.
I mean, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Do you? I apologize for that. Do you find that you can recognize a drying house profile because of their local environmental fermentations are distinct to that
see
one
where you're
farm,
going.
or can you? I mean, I assume you can by region because weather changes so much.
Yeah. I can definitely taste the character of a particular farm/farmer for sure.
Okay.
How much that has to do with the region, it's almost impossible to separate from the terroir of the tea.
Right.
Because they're not making tea from other regions there, because you
Right.
need to make the tea where the tea is picked.
Right.
And so the processing is all going on site, close to the mountain where the tea is grown. You can give that to the toad, that's a little rinse.
Could you ever tell? Give it to the toad. Could you ever tell if they were doing something wrong? Like pick up something and be like, oh, their process was rushed in this way.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. You get from Pu-erh specifically, you get like this.
There we go.
Fishy notes. You like fish food, ammonia, really, really bad rushed fermentation. They call it the dui wei, which means the pile taste. And that is there, and it will go away. So even if you do a good job of fermenting tea, if you let it rest, you let it breathe, it will have that, and then it will go away. If it's poorly cured, it's purely fermented, if it's rushed in any way, if there's shortcuts being taken, then you don't get that going away.
They
You
just
end up
pack it
having
in.
this, exactly, and then you end up having this fishy, gross, fishy, and the character of the tea, it doesn't taste clear, it doesn't taste like transparent, it tastes
Murky.
muddy. Yeah,
Can you smell it before you make it?
Absolutely.
Okay, it's like in the brick or the cookie.
Yeah, and
Okay.
if not then when I heat it up, and if not then now.
Yeah.
You know, I will definitely smell it before we get to drinking it.
Yeah.
This wet smell after I've rinsed it, that's absolutely, I will smell it at
That's
that point. If
interesting.
I didn't catch it before, I'll catch it then.
So the difference between small farms and large commercially available supermarket tea, what is the difference there?
The difference is that a factory is producing tea, a tea factory where what you get in a supermarket is going to be this commodity scale import on container ships, et cetera. And those teas are being purchased by importers from these big factories. And those factories are getting tea from dozens or hundreds of farmers around the region that are using all kinds of different growing practices. God knows what they're doing with their tea. God knows what they're doing. It will all be processed together, but that process will be machines, it'll be mechanized, it'll be optimized for efficiency, it'll be optimized for consistency, it'll be optimized for being, inexpensive, not costing a whole bunch in payroll.
And they just figure all the variants are going to wash out in the mix.
They wash out because they blend it together.
Yeah.
You've got this very heterogeneous, product base that you're drawing from with very little control and oversight as to the individual.
And that's when you get
processes.
there's PG Tips or Thai Foo's generic house blends.
Those would actually be a little bit different because those are the legacy of the British Indian tea industry, which was basically like colonialism, slavery, situation. So that's a little different because you're getting those from these big giant farms. In China, there's this lack of oversight. In India, this is one company's fields that they just took from the people.
So
who
that
lived
never
there.
happened in China, where they ended up with a giant, what would have been a PG Tips house.
There's big
kind of
tea.
profile?
There's big tea factories in China, and there's some big tea farms. But in general, the big factories are not necessarily owning and working and farming all of the land that they're using to make their tea.
Man,
they
this-
are buying the unfinished leaves from farmers in the region.
This sounds a lot more like the French brandy cognac
Yes.
approach. You guys need to have a cognac brandy person on this show
That'd be cool.
because the way that it works in Armagnac, cognac, and brandy. Let's just say brandy because that's the parent category, really.
Yeah.
In brandy, which is you don't have mass distilleries like a Middleton, or in beer a Guinness company, right? Who's like huge volume of product. What you have in brandy is 100 vineyards, from 2 acres to 20, and each of them are processing their own grapes or selling off to larger producers, but often they're buying barrels from these small,
Yeah,
right? And
even
you'll
more
have a
so.
farm distiller that comes around and like distills for each farmer
wow.
for them, and then barrels it for them.
Right.
And so
That's
each of these
cool,
little like
actually.
local families have their own brandy barrels, and then you'll get the big cognac Armagnac houses.
Right.
They will go around and buy barrels from all these small farmers, and then they'll blend them to create the public
That-
release of Armagnac.
That is much more, when we're talking about Pu-erh
Yeah.
specifically,
Yeah.
that is what the Pu-erh industry looks like until about the year 2000 is when you start seeing, or in the late 90s, you get the Pu-erh boom, the Pu-erh bubble,
Right.
when China open door policy, now you've got like market economy in China. people really like Pu-erh. They're coming in now. We used to be seen as this like kind of medicinal tea that is for, rustic people. But then it gets like, oh, you can age it. It increases in value with age. Investment opportunity. Now there's a bubble because all of the Pu-erh is being bought up, and it's not because people are drinking it. It's because people are speculating. They're investing in it. And
that's
so
also
now,
the whiskey market.
Exactly. And then you start to see farmers being like, oh, there's money in this tea. Now instead of selling my produce to the factory every year and getting pennies, I am going to set up a workshop.
Right.
I'm going to start finishing my tea myself. And that's where this 小堆子, I kept using that term, under a ton, 小堆子, over a ton, 我堆,
like small
process.
batch.
Exactly, small batch. That's when you start. These farmers have never before fermented tea.
Man.
Because that is not a farmer's skill set. The skill set of fermenting tea was developed for Pu-erh in 1972 in the factories.
Oh, wow, okay.
And so now in the year, the turn of the century, tea starts to be worth spending time. Now there's an economic incentive to the farmer to artisanally process and finish their tea because there's a middle class that can buy that and will appreciate it.
That's so cool. There was a memory I have when we visited Waterford in Ireland, which is an Irish distillery, and they're doing single farm distillations of whiskey. So like in Ireland, right? And so like here's a farmer with what we would consider to be like 5 acres.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is just barely a farm as far as Americans are concerned, right? And this guy, they're harvesting only his barley, putting it in a container only from him, and then distilling only his whiskey through his grain through the still. And they said the biggest impact they had from all of this was they had these farmers who were 3rd, 4th, 5th generation Irish farmers who had only ever just planted grain, harvested, and sold it to the giant conglomerates making beer and Guinness and the malt buyers.
Yes.
Right? And all of a sudden, they could come into their distillery, and 2 years, 3 years in, they could say, here, that's your farm.
Yeah.
And the farmer would just
cry.
He's just like, I've never in my life have I held the product of my own hands and my own. He's like, all my friends who make fruit or who plant, vegetables, they all get to taste the work of their hands. And we've never had that.
They're
we grow shit,
blend.
we harvest it, we dump it off at that refinery over there, and we walk away.
Yeah.
For the first time ever, I get to brag with my other farmer friends, here's what my farm makes.
Exactly.
And I can imagine that that's having that same kind of impact all of a sudden.
That is literally this guy's story. Li Shulin made the tea that we just drank, made this tea. One of my oldest friends in China, he is a consummate tea master. His dad was a tea master. It's in his blood. And
this has got chocolate.
Yep. This is we're getting into the second steeping now, and it's going to get a little bit richer.
And
but
this
so
has been what we've been noticing here on the show too, with Wilson Valley Mercantile, and a lot of the what they're calling estate farming.
Yes,
now.
I love those. Yeah. Those have been the ones that this whole show, the ones that have really jumped out and grabbed me have been those single farm.
Has he seen a reward for that? Like, is it working for him?
Absolutely. So
does it give his family more of an identity for them? Like, this is look at what we do.
Absolutely. His tea is his identity. He says some of the, tea trees. I've said this before on the show, but I love saying this. Tea trees are like vampires. They're immortal. If something doesn't kill them, they will keep on living. There's tea trees that are more than 1,000 years old, so they say. They're still making tea, and the tea from those trees is better. It's highly sought after. It's the most valuable of all in the whole world of Pu-erh tea specifically. Gushu cha, ancient tree tea, is like what it is.
What's the marker when it becomes ancient?
There isn't one.
Okay.
There's no way to know. There's no way to know how old the tree is because you can't count the rings because they're tropical plants, and all you have to cut them down, and you won't want to do that. And there's no strict cutoff. It's just something that people say, and you just have to trust the people you work with and trust your own sense.
Well, and here you can see an oak tree, and any Texan can tell you that's an old oak tree.
Right.
Just on sight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. They don't know how old.
Yeah, it could be 50, 80, it could be 100, it could be 200.
Exactly.
But it's old.
And what we're looking for is the way that the tea feels. And so you say, oh, it's a big tree. Let me make some tea from it. Num, num, num. Okay, it feels like Gushu cha. And also, these people have been living there for 400 years.
They know.
So it's like, if Grandpa said, hey, look at that old tea tree when you were a kid and now you're 60, you can assume that tea tree's pretty old because Grandpa thought it was old too.
So does he have those trees on his land?
Having land, you lease lots. No one actually owns land in China. The government owns all the land. Everyone leases land from the government. And so with tea, we're talking like, 2 acres, 5 acres is tiny, but these people are like, the total mass of land that they're working with sometimes is going to be less than an acre. A lot of the time it's going to be less than an acre. Yeah, very small. Tea, getting a high yield out of tea is not as much about how much land you have as about how good your plucking schedule is. Because you pick it and then it grows back. And it grows back 2 days later, 2-3 days later. But if you wait too long and the buds open,
it's like a basil plant. As soon as the top of the basil plant starts flowering, it's like, ooh, you waited too long. You
and you can still harvest it, and it will be lower quality tea, and it won't grow back after that. You pluck that, and the leaf won't grow back. The bud will grow back.
Okay.
And so when you look at this tea here, we've got some leaves and some buds in this tea that we just drank earlier. Let me see if I can
Are they doing it by hand?
Yeah, picking the tea by hand. Processing, a lot of the processes are by hand. He's gotten some new machines lately that's made his process more efficient.
Even though they're old trees.
Okay, gotcha.
This is the leaf. And so the bud, here, I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but the bud is this little thin, delicate, tapered thing. And what that does is opens up into a leaf. If this is picked when the bud is a bud, it will come back. You pick it again when it's a bud, it will come back. And you get a couple flushes throughout the growing season. If you wait until this opens, they say it's fa lao, got old, opened all the way. Pick it, you can drink it. It won't be as expensive, it won't be as good, but it also won't come back. And so you're not only is the tea quality going down, but your ability to harvest from that plant is reduced. And so your yield is more dependent on how vigilant and how timely
paying attention.
you are.
How big are these plants?
Even though they're like old trees, it's the new growth that you're picking.
That's what tea is. Tea is the new growth. It's like when you look at a pine tree in the spring and there's all the little green tips, that's what we drink. And Li Shulin, his deal is that Dad was a tea master, Mom was a tea master. He grew up in the factory, the dye factory, was called the Munghai factory back then. Literally grew up as a child there, sleeping on piles of tea leaves. Was working with tea his whole life. Since he was like 13 years old, he's out there working with tea, picking tea. He was, he lived through that process of developing in 1972 that technique for fermenting tea. He learned how to ferment tea in the factory, working with tons and tons of tea. Fast forward to the year 2000, he's growing tea, still working at the factory in 1997, 98, 99, still working at the factory, but he is now growing tea and he gets into what's called Shengtai Nongye, ecological agriculture, like organic agriculture, but it's a little bit different. The definition is you don't water the plants, you don't prune the plants, you don't fertilize the plants.
What's going to happen is what's going to happen.
What's going to happen, if they die, they die. He's very metal about it. He's like, oh yeah, if that plant's going to die, I'm like, do you do anything about it? He's like, no. If that plant's going to die, then it's supposed to die. I don't want to drink a weak plant. You don't want to drink the plants that are weak. And so that's the goal is for the plants to taste and feel like they're a wild plant living out in the wild. And at that time, it was very uncommon for an individual farmer to ferment a batch of tea that was just from one farm. Just like we're talking about with your Irish guys. They were sending it and it was getting, and that's not just because of the economics, that's because of the allometry of the process. This process was developed for 5-10 metric tons of tea.
Right.
And that's when Li Shulin was in the factory.
How do you do it with a hand shovel?
Exactly. How do you scale that down? Everything changes.
Right.
You just take the size down, everything changes. The timing,
because it's going to cool down more quickly, it's going to dry more quickly.
It's going to dry more quickly. And the heat, the temperature, you reach into a pile of tea that's doing this, you pull it out, it's steaming. And so
but not if it's this tall.
Exactly. So what are the limits? How much do you need? How little can you do it with? How much can you do it with? Where are those changes happening? That's called xiaodui, as opposed to wodui, the big industrial process. Xiaodui is a small piling, and at the time, if a farmer wanted to ferment their tea, they would send it off. First it was they were selling their unfinished tea, and then it was out of their hands, and they get paid their 15 cents on the dollar or whatever, and then the factory sells it and makes the bulk of the profit.
Right.
Then they're moved on, like, oh, farmers are making their own tea, they're growing their own tea. The first tea that we had, Sheng Pu-erh, very easy to produce. There's not as much skill or equipment or expertise required. I can make it. I'm not good at it, but I can do it. You can do it in your kitchen. You get a wok, you heat it up, you cook the tea, the freshly picked tea leaves in it, you dry it in the sun. Almost anyone can do that. And so farmers were making their own Sheng Pu-erh because like, oh, there's money in Pu-erh, there's money in Pu-erh. Finally, like, I'm not just selling to the factory, I'm going to make my own product. They're making Sheng Pu-erh. Li Shulin wants to make Shu Pu-erh, the fermented kind. At that time, if you're a farmer and you want to make Shu Pu-erh, You send your tea to a factory or a workshop. They consolidate it with a bunch of other.
This is like a malter for barley.
Exactly. Yeah. Apparently so. Exactly. They blend it all together, and you sent in 100 kilos, you get back 100 kilos, but it's not your 100 kilos.
It's just 100 kilos.
It's 100 kilos, and it might have some % of your tea in there, but it's also got Joe Bob down the road who's putting Roundup on his tea.
Right.
And so Li Shulin gets into ecological agriculture. He's like he goes around to the other mountains and tries to get people to do this, right? He is very passionate about ecological agriculture. Him and his wife are like crusaders for this philosophy of farming because they care about the land. They're from there. They're Aka people. They're the indigenous people of this place. They're not Han Chinese. And they care about Nanhua Mountain. They care about Manla. They care about the ecosystem. So they're like, no, stop putting pesticides on your ship. But he doesn't want his very, very fancy,
just go in the pile,
pristine tea to go get mixed with Joe Bob's tea with the Roundup and then come back to him. So he taught himself, based on his experiences at the factory, how to scale down this process and do this xiaoduizi. And he's not the only one who does it. Lots of farmers do xiaoduizi right now, but there's not a standard for it. Everyone has to just figure it out.
That reminds me of the story of Jared Hempstead going to larger distilleries and asking them, how do you do these things?
Yeah.
Because I want to learn, and finding out that he has to scale things himself. He has to reinvent the
You have to
entire
reinvent
thing.
the
They're
whole
like, we can't tell you how to do it at that size, or in this heat in Texas environments, or
exactly.
we can't tell you how to get old whiskey in an environment where your barrel house can get to 140 Fahrenheit.
Yep.
Like, they're not dealing with that in Scotland.
Yeah, exactly. But to answer your question, has it paid off? Absolutely. I've seen this guy. When I met Li Shulin, he didn't have a car, right? He was running a noodle shop.
Yeah.
And he would run a noodle shop most of the year, and then in the season, he would pick tea and process tea. He was 2 years into a 5-year process of developing an even smaller, more artisanal fermentation style called Yuan Sheng Tuo, which we've had some on this show before. And I've seen him thrive and grow. And also in 2022, his house burned down.
Oh, jeez.
He lost everything. He lost 20 years of tea.
Oh.
All his money was in his tea. All his money was in the form of tea because, again, it gets better the older it gets. His retirement, his savings was tea. Burned down. House gone. Car gone. All his growing equipment gone. But we were able to do a fundraiser here for him because I've been talking about him. People who watch my show, drink tea, go to our website, come to the tea house, they all know his name because he's our main dude. He's one of my oldest friends who makes tea, and he makes maybe like 30% of all the tea that we get is from this one guy. We represent like 40 different farmers,
Right.
you know what I mean? So he's hugely overrepresented here because of that relationship and the quality of what he does. We were able to raise like $23,000 for him. We did a fundraiser. He got all that money. He bought a new house. China, you know.
Yeah.
China, rural China. What are you gonna do? You know. Got a new house. He's doing great. He moved to Manhua. He'll FaceTime me, WeChat FaceTime me at like 3 a.m. where it's daytime for them. And he'll just be like wasted with his homies being like, hey, Sohan, check it out. My friends, we're having a feast. We killed a pig. So like that's the kind of dude we're talking about. He's my homie. And he loves to drink. If y'all ever come to China with me, bring some whiskey. I'm sure he'll love it.
Speaking of which...
let me say first, my last smell on this one, before the last pour, at the empty glass, I got a weird, grape note all of a sudden out of nowhere.
Yeah. This is as far as Pu-erh goes, this is one of the most complex Pu-erhs.
And a little sarsaparilla, like what would go into like a root beer syrup.
Usually Pu-erhs are very, very earthy, and they have that petrichor note, and that's kind of all they do. They're kind of a one-trick pony. This one is special because it is from only one patch and only one pile.
So it doesn't wash out all the variances.
Exactly. So you get the terroir of the microclimate of the Duoyi patch at the 1950 meters right at the top of Nanhua Mountain, the finest tea on Nanhua Mountain. This is not blended with the tea from any of the other patches, and it's not blended from multiple piles. It's one patch, one pile, one big pile, all fermented together, and it's not multiple little piles that are then being blended. Because he'll do that sometimes. He'll do multiple piles depending on how much space he has. It's all from the same harvest, multiple piles, they all have their own character, blend them together. But this is one patch, one pile, and so it has a lot more nuance than you usually get, which you won't ever get this level of nuance and subtlety and complexity from a factory Pu-erh because it's not one patch, it's not one pile, it's not one mountain.
This is blended. This is budget blended whiskey versus single malt, single distillery.
This is like that. these Irish farmers with their 5 acres, and it's their grain, and every single thing that they this has come from this one place. It is the distilled essence of this place and this person and their career.
That's cool.
This has just got me thinking home, hearth, fireplace. It's just, it's
very homey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got whiskey.
Yeah,
for
I'm
us?
gonna pour you this one, and let's just keep this talking about the whiskey instead
Sure.
of stuff. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to promote anything.
We can talk.
Is that okay with you guys? Can I not promote anything and just hang out and
fine.
Yeah.
drink whiskey?
Yeah,
That's
that's
okay.
what
Love
we're
that.
here for.
Yeah, then I'm over promoting things. So it's story time. Story time, children. When I was a wee young lad of 22 or 3.
Last year.
Yeah, last year. I was a whiskey drinker. I was known as I was a touring musician. That's what I did for a living for most of my life. And I was famous for whiskey. That was my thing. Because when you tour, you can't guarantee what you're going to get. So a cocktail in one bar might be great, and the next bar, terrible.
Right.
You never know. But what you can't screw up is whiskey out of a bottle into a glass. Right? Or you can. I've had it done, but it's real hard. You got to work at it.
Yeah.
And so I just started drinking Irish whiskey because that was basically Powers and was my go-to. Jameson and Powers, those are my two. Sometimes Bushmills, but mostly Jameson and Powers if I could find it. At the time, it was really almost impossible to find Powers. So
Yes. Yeah.
but
Not that long ago.
yeah. Then I went to my dad's house and he said, "Hey, you got to try this single malt Scotch." I'm like, "I don't know, Scotch is smoky." He's like, no, this isn't smoky. Ironically, because I love smoky Scotch now, but at the time it was like, nah.
Yeah.
And he said, "I found this. It's a distillery that I've never even heard of. They were on a trip and they found it in a Mexican shop on the tourist trap off of a cruise ship.
Right.
And it's called Longmorn. 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 And it's a Speyside distillery, which is just right up in the dead middle of the high altitude, highlandy, mountainy kind of regions. I don't know if this one's in that high of the mountains, but it's in the Speyside Highland region of Scotland. And what I come to find out later is that it's considered a distiller's malt. And I'll explain what that means in a second. But I tried this, and my brain sort of short-circuited for a second. And then it went, wait, what? This is possible? This is what's possible in the world? And it was, I don't normally prescribe. I normally just say experience your experience. But I'm going to get a little bit heavy-handed, which I don't recommend anyone do in a tasting, but I'm going to do it. Because I'm going to tell you my experience and see if you experience it. I picked it up and immediately it was this earthy, mulchy, gardeny, farm, barnyardy kind of malt. Immediately overwhelmed by the sweet berries and dense fruit explosion. Surrounded by like glazed butterscotch type notes, right? Like the charring of a vanilla cream, like a creme brulee. And then on the first sip, it did this sweet fruit explosion. And then at the very end, there was just this little sparkly note of black pepper that just sort of like flickered through the space and then went on its way like a butterfly. So here's to you.
Beautiful.
Cheers to you.
Cheers.
Yeah,
Cheers.
4 berries jam.
Right?
I recognize the name on the side of that bottle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you do. That's why I brought it.
Cheers.
Richard bought and donated this bottle to the
Oh,
vault.
beautiful.
But I took it away from the vault and brought it to my house.
It's really nice.
And I replaced it in the vault with another one.
Yeah.
I just, when Richard no longer worked on the property, I wanted to have that bottle. So I brought it specifically.
Get the autograph.
Yeah, because Richard's name is on the side of it.
It's crispy. You know? I don't know how else to say it.
it's
crispy.
crisp.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're going off of feeling, it's not sharp, but it's crisp in the way that citrus or a crisp apple or would come across as crisp.
It's balanced.
Yes.
It's got body, but it's not heavy. It's really, really lovely. And it's definitely kind of different for me from a lot of Scotch whiskeys that I've had. Because I love smoke. And so whenever people hear, they're like, oh, let me give you all the smoky Scotches. So I'm like, okay, great, we'll have smoky Scotch. But I haven't had as much Speyside.
Yeah.
And I really love it.
There's
It's
a
nice.
density to this
Yes,
that I
yeah,
really
there is.
love.
Yeah,
That makes it feel like a fall spirit.
Very fall, very
right?
fall
Like
vibes.
the leaves are hanging and like there's
Yeah.
dense foliage on the ground and they're
yeah.
starting to get that musty smell
and
because
that
it's damp.
crisp feeling, you know,
And the air,
that
like,
crisp
ooh,
feeling in the
oh,
air.
hey, that like hopefully we'll get here in at least 3 months from today in Texas.
This was one of those whiskeys. Daniel appeared out of nowhere on a really, really slow day at the tasting room. There was nobody. And it's like, and he's carrying this bottle of Longmorn. And he goes, you know what this is? And I said, yeah, I know what that is. That's one of your favorite whiskeys. And he goes, you want to try some? Like, honestly, that's the whole memory.
Yeah.
It's just that. And then the two of us watching a fall day.
Yep.
Cool.
Just standing on the deck at the distillery.
No words, just experiencing a fall day with some Longmorn. And that, honestly, is more than any conversation that two guys can have, is just to sit there with a glass of this whiskey.
just
I could
be.
feel that whole memory just from you talking about it and smelling the whiskey in
Right.
my breath and just feeling this feeling, and it's good. It's nice. Yeah, it's nice.
And now we get to share it with you, which makes me even more
Right.
happy. Yeah.
What I love about this is, and this is why they call it a distiller's malt. Maybe there's a word for this in tea, but in bands we call it, or in music industry we call it, well, that's a musician's band. What that means is like nobody really knows who they are or loves them except musicians. That's like King's X, or you know, like Yes was a musician's band, or Rush is a general famous band, but it's also a musician's band. Like all the music nerds love
Because
those
it's very
bands.
technical, and
Yeah,
very
very accomplished.
virtuosic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what I've discovered, this is a distiller's malt. The distillery Longmorn, that's a distiller's distillery.
Cool.
Like that's a distillery that the general public has never heard of, but all the people who make whiskey in Scotland, they know Longmorn. Now most of what they make goes into blends, and that's why you're not going to try it. It goes into Johnny Walker. Or, you know, I don't know what it goes into, but Johnny Walker or say like a Chivas type thing, that's what it goes into the blends. So they don't normally release a lot of the single malt whiskey, but they do release this one.
It's good. It's really nice.
When
also,
you go into the
Microbes.
tea, the berries explode.
Yeah, that sort of grapey sarsaparilla note that's almost like a syrupy soda syrup.
Yeah.
It's dominating now.
And it brings out some like creamy notes too out of the tea. When I do one after the other, the mouthfeel like in the throat, I get this like dairy, almost like a creamy dairy kind of.
When you refilled it, it
Bounciness.
softened this tea a little bit.
Yeah.
On that last refill you did.
Yeah, my water. Here, let me try this. I think it's hot. Yeah, I just reheated my water, so I'm gonna try that again with a fresh pot of water because it was cold. It's the problem with this show. The filming of a show, a podcast, you know, format is that you end up with cold water sometimes.
And it distracted.
Yeah, you get distracted, and I was for a while. I was trying not to boil water on camera because it's loud, but I think we've all got loud enough voices that it's okay. Some of our guests are like a little more demure.
This is reminding me of a jasmine plant, or not jasmine, or honeysuckle. Like I have a honeysuckle plant in my backyard that I'm trying to keep alive in the midst of this brutal heat. And it's not the jasmine flower, it's the whole plant, right? It's the whole, like when I'm watering it and I have to lean over to water it, and I am getting the bud, but I'm also getting the mulch, and I'm also getting the plant, and it's the mix of all things.
Yeah.
Wow.
I have a friend named Jason Souter who's just a brilliant brilliant human being, but a brilliant whiskey guy. And he talks about smelling and tasting whiskeys that younger whiskeys or immature whiskeys, or you'll often smell what your brain will experience as components of something, right? So I might pick up a whiskey and say, I smell vanilla and pastry and brown sugar and, right?
Yeah.
But then you'll get an older whiskey that's more developed and more well-rounded and more balanced, and you'll go, cinnamon roll. Well, earlier on, it was all the ingredients of a cinnamon roll.
Right.
But then when it got balanced, it became the final product thing, right?
Yeah.
And so often when I smell whiskey they've tried to make taste some way, or they're forcing one direction, you end up smelling the fake feeling of like pretend rose, not real rose.
Right.
Or like, but people don't realize that rose doesn't smell like the rose smelling things in the shop.
Right.
Yeah.
Rose smells like rose, but it also smells like green. It's what do you call it?
The thorns. Then.
Yeah, and it smells like the earth that it's growing in. It smells like the room and the house and the field.
It's not just the
It smells like the air.
Yeah.
It's not just the scent of the flower. And even the flower you smell, it's more bitter. It's
not
more
just
astringent.
The fragrance,
It's
there's
not
the
just
petals.
sweet.
You know, you've got the actual vegetable matter.
Sap, that's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
It's also the sap of the plant is in there, right? But if you go to the store and buy a rose-smelling scented thing, it's minus all of that complexity.
The way you started with the whiskey was saying, you know, this is not normally what I do. I allow other people to have their own experience with it. I find in sales, when I'm actually selling something, having something for somebody to grab onto.
Yeah, just even one thing, an anchor.
Yeah, to give them a reason. I usually keep it short and sweet, so it's not too long. One of the ones that I used with Ironroot Promethean is there is in the middle. It's an herb garden, but it's brushing past the herbs in the herb garden.
Yeah,
it's not.
I could see that.
It's not chewing on the seeds that you get from the rye grains that with a lot of ryes, where you get the heavy seeds, but it's more of that brush on your clothes through the herb garden. And so having that kind of experience or those types of notes, it allows the consumer to explore it with you.
Yeah.
And then it's like, tell me what you get. And a lot of times it's like, yes, that was unusual. Whereas at one point, you know, the consumer would go, that's unusual.
And then stop.
And stop.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's not what I expected, but this was what I was getting. This is where the complexity that I'm finding. What are you finding allows to bring them into that kind of conversation.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, I always think, you know, the enemy of creativity is blank page, not restrictions. Everyone thinks that restrictions limit your creativity. I don't want rules. I'm a creative. But the actual enemy of creativity is no rules.
Yeah.
Because you flounder. That's called blank page syndrome.
Yeah.
If I give you a blank page and said, write a cool sentence, you are screwed. Right? But if I
Give me
said
a prompt.
if I said I'm gonna give you a prompt and I'm gonna give you can only write 3 sentences and it needs to include this one word. All of a sudden you're like, okay, done, I can do that. And you're gonna give me some cool stuff. When you're trying to help people at a tasting, if I say, what do you smell? Everyone freezes.
Yeah.
Oh shit.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do I do? Right? But if I can give you, like Richard said, just one small anchor, sometimes I find that there's a little bit of a note of berries in here, but there's a lot of other things too. What do you smell? Oh, I get that berries. Okay, what else do you get? And then all of a sudden they've relaxed from the pressure.
Yeah.
They're not overwhelmed with trying to invent correct tasting notes out of thin air.
Yeah, and you know it's like when you look at one of those pictures, you're like, I don't know what I'm looking at. Someone says it's a lady looking to the side. You're like, oh, and then you see it, and you can't unsee it.
You got to make your eyes cross. It's a sailboat.
Right,
It's that one 3D sailboat.
Exactly. It's like you're looking at the image and you're just not recognizing the pattern.
Yeah.
And someone pointing that out to you can be really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Especially when you're into something like the world of whiskey, where there is this emphasis on being able to note those things, pull out those notes. I like to, when I do that with tea, I'll canvas, I'll be like, what does it smell like to you? Does it remind you of anything? What does it smell like to you? But giving people, and then I'll be like, and I'll wait for everyone to say what they're gonna say, and then I'll be like, some people say it smells like Cheez-Its. And everyone's like, oh, that's the thing I was smelling that I didn't notice. You know, there is a tea that we just got that I freaking love, EIEA, that I've had more than one person say it smells like Cheez-Its. So like you had Oreos, we got Nabisco represented here.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Oreos, yeah.
I like this one best, this round.
That's steeping,
Yeah.
Yeah, and this chunk is opening up. You know, that was just like a little piece of a cake that I broke off.
Yeah.
This is my tea knife here. You know, I broke it off with my tea knife.
Can I see that?
Yeah. It's not fancy. It looks
No,
fancy,
I just wanted to see what the shape was.
but it's,
okay, cool.
Like
a little leather opener.
It's like a letter opener. Yeah. And a letter opener is pretty ideal. Letter opener, oyster shucker is kind of the ideal shape for it. For me, for a Pu-erh tea knife, you can use there's needle ones, which are good for white tea.
I prefer a machete, but that's fine.
Yeah.
For me, this is a return home with friends, with no complications, just good conversation. The tea is earthy and inviting. The whiskey is evolving into darker fruit and darker fruit notes with the tea. I'm getting plums now, or prunes.
I'm getting that.
Yeah, so honestly, this has been so
I think that
enjoyable.
Plum is going to be coming from the fact that there is sherry cask in this.
Yeah, yeah.
They do 3 types of casks for this finish from the barrel house.
The fact that also, there's we're here in Austin. UT Austin, very prominent. The Longhorns. This is the only word I've ever
Who's
heard.
that? What? Never heard of him.
But yeah, Mookum. Mookum.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Well, thank you, Daniel, once again for coming here and sharing with us some of your favorites and some of your stories. This is a very welcoming place. As Sohan said, this is going to be the last episode at this location. We've had an 8-week hiatus. It looks like our next guest is probably not going to be until mid-September. So there's going to be a little bit of a lull going on, but we've got many adventures planned for you in the future. Daniel, you are working at the Wizard Academy. You have certification programs to teach people.
We don't need to talk about
He doesn't want to promote stuff. He doesn't want to promote stuff.
This is about us and drinking good moments together.
Cheers.
Cheers to you with the tea.
And they say lo bochido, and the people who make this tea, they do have a cheers for tea, and it's lo bochido,
No bochido.
lo bochido, and then we go sai, 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 and then we all drank.
Sai.
Yeah, I need to practice that with you.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
They do that when they're drinking alcohol, and they say jibachido. It's cool. They got a great culture. Like, you'd love these guys. These guys are. I wish I could teleport them here right now. They would love the whiskey.
I would hide this one, bring out the powers.
And that's one of the things that I really wanted. I wanted to bring people together. I wanted to sit down. I wanted to bring my whiskey friends to talk to Sohan. I wanted Sohan to talk tea to all of y'all so that we could find a place where we can sit together and just share a memory.
And here we are. Cheers.
Cheers.